Hello, I'm Steve Young, and welcome to Mastering the Art of Impressioning. Impressioning is the single most important skill that a locksmith can learn. On a typical day, a locksmith who really understands impressioning may be able to do 2 to 3 times as many jobs as the locksmith who cannot impression. Impressioning makes the hard jobs easy and the simple jobs even easier. Making a key to most foreign cars becomes a matter of minutes instead of hours. Once you master the art of impressioning, other methods of making keys, such as pulling door panels, progression charts, and tryout keys, will seem like a complete waste of time. The secret of impressioning is being able to visualize exactly how the lock is built inside and learning how to read the marks on the key. If you do not understand how the lock works, you will never be able to impression it. In this tape, I will concentrate on teaching you what happens inside the lock during the impressioning process, and how to read the different types of marks that you will get from different types of locks. There are also several basic methods of bumping the key inside the lock that you will need to learn. This tape is divided into 2 sections. The first part of the tape will deal with wafer or disc tumbler locks, and the second part of the tape will cover pin tumbler locks, which are generally considered harder to impression than wafer tumbler locks. The only thing that pin tumbler locks have in common with wafer tumbler locks is that they are both operated by a key. The process of impressioning these different types of locks is just as different as the locks themselves. The methods of bumping, the type of marks that each lock will give, are completely different for each type of lock. In this tape, you will see me impression 5 different locks, 3 wafer tumbler locks, and 2 pin tumbler locks. You will see a simple cam lock, a single-bitted Toyota ignition lock, a late model double-bitted Toyota door lock, a Ford pin tumbler door lock, and a pin tumbler schlage mortise lock. Each of these locks was chosen to give you examples of the different techniques needed to impression different types of locks. The material covered in this tape cannot be absorbed in one viewing. As you watch the tape, be prepared to pause or rewind your VCR until you have learned each technique. Pay particular attention to the close-up views of the marks. Learning to read the different types of marks is the most important part of impressioning. Learning the art of impressioning is really very simple. You must first learn exactly how the lock is built. Then use that knowledge to force the lock into telling you what is preventing the lock from turning. Once you understand what the lock is telling you, it is a simple matter to file the key to fit the lock. The movement of the key inside the lock must always do 2 things. It must bind the key against the tumblers that are preventing the lock from turning. Then, when the key is bumped, it will force the lock to leave a mark on the key. Being able to read these marks is the secret to understanding what the lock is telling you, and practice is the secret to learning to read those marks. You cannot practice too much. There is an aha factor involved in learning to impression. One day, while you're practicing, you will suddenly realize what the lock has been trying to tell you all along. Suddenly, impressioning will seem like the most natural thing in the world. You'll soon wonder what all the fuss was about. Before we begin impressioning, let's take a few minutes to learn about the tools we'll be using. Your eyes are the most important tool that you will need for impressioning. Good eyesight is absolutely essential for reading the marks on the key. Unfortunately, everyone is not equipped with perfect eyesight. A magnifying visor like this one is a simple, inexpensive way to improve your vision and your impressioning skills. Most visors feature an adjustable headband and flip-up lenses for convenience. Some visors also offer you a variety of different lenses with different levels of magnification. Even if you have perfect vision, a magnifying visor can often help you by bringing out marks that are too small to be seen even with perfect vision. If you're having trouble seeing the marks, don't hesitate to use a magnifier to help you see better. In making this tape, I used a variety of different lenses to make the marks visible to the camera. Being able to precisely control the movement of the key inside the lock during the impressioning process is very important. You must have a tool that will give you a firm grip on the key blank. The traditional tool has been a pair of locking pliers like these. If you use locking pliers, I recommend the Vice Grip brand 5WR 5-inch long locking pliers. These will give you a good grip on the key, and they are small enough that you will still get a good feel for the lock. If you have smaller hands, you may prefer the 4-inch long locking pliers. Avoid using larger sizes. They make it harder to get a feel for the lock, and they make it too easy to damage the lock or break off the key inside the lock. Recently, several new tools have been introduced specifically for impressioning. These are the Freeman and the Jiffy Model A impressioning tools. Both of these tools allow you to grip the head of the key blank firmly with less damage to the key than by using locking pliers. But the main advantage to using a tool like these is that they force you to keep your hand aligned with the center line of the lock. As you will soon see, this is especially important on wafer tumbler locks. The Jiffy tool uses a machined stainless steel head. The key is locked into place against the serrations inside the head by 2 Allen screws. The Allen wrench is stored inside the plastic handle of the tool. The handle also features a ridge along the side which prevents the tool from rolling and provides an index so that you always know which side of the key is which when you are impressioning double-bitted locks. The Freeman tool uses a vise-like action to hold the key in place against 2 hardened steel pins inside the vise. The vise is tightened by turning the knob at the rear of the tool while holding the key in place with your other hand. The Freeman tool is essentially a one-piece tool. There are no other parts to lose. But its all-metal construction makes it a somewhat more expensive tool than the Jiffy tool. The choice of one tool over the other is strictly personal preference. As I mentioned earlier, practice is the only way you will ever become proficient at impressioning. A plate like this one can be very helpful for holding a lock rigidly while you practice your impressioning. These plates are relatively inexpensive and are available from most locksmith supply houses. The file that you use is determined strictly by personal preference. These are 2 of the most common types: a Pippin file and an 8-inch long pattern maker's file. My favorite is the pattern maker's file. I use the tip for most of the cutting and the wider part of the file to widen the cuts. The most important thing in selecting a file is to choose a very fine cut. Both of these files are a number 4 cut, which I personally prefer. A number 2 cut will also work for impressioning, but it is somewhat coarser than I like. As you will see, it is important that the file leave behind a very fine matte surface. With the proper surface on the key, the marks will be much easier to see. The finer the matte surface, the easier it will be to see the marks. This is a Pippin file, which is sometimes referred to as an appleseed file. In fact, the word Pippin actually means appleseed. Many people like the teardrop shape for impressioning. They use the sides of the file to widen the cuts and the rounded edge of the file to deepen the cuts. You are the only one who can determine which file is right for you. Try both and use the one that you can control the best, because control is what's really important. That completes the tool section. Now let's take a look at a very basic technique that is absolutely essential for successful impressioning: proper filing techniques. Impressioning files only cut in one direction. That's on the forward stroke of the file. Dragging the file backwards through the cuts is known as backfiling. This does not remove any metal. In fact, it destroys the fine matte surface that you're trying to put onto the key in the first place and makes your marks harder to see. Because of the necessity to keep the file in the cuts for proper spacing, it is sometimes easier to backfile the cut. Pull the file backwards through the cuts. Just make sure that your last few strokes across the key are always in the forward direction. This will leave a nice matte surface for the marks. Another important technique is called draw filing. This is bringing the impressioning file down the length of the blade sideways. This is to prepare the key blank before it is inserted into the lock for impressioning. The point is to remove any plating that's on the key and prepare the top edge of the key to accept the impressioning marks. That is, to put the matte surface on the blade of the key. Some people sharpen the blade into a knife blade. This will enhance marks sometimes, but I feel it's too easy to file away too much of the blade and actually lose marks. I will only blade the key if I'm having trouble getting marks in the first place. Here's our key blank as seen from above. This one has been prepared for impressioning. Notice that it has a very smooth matte surface, a series of small lines running very uniformly across the surface of the blade. This one has not been prepared. It has plating across it and the surface is very rough. If you started with the blank this way, it would be very hard to see your marks. The prepared key blank, on the other hand, virtually anything that touches the blade of that key will leave some sort of mark that we can interpret. Notice how changing the light changes the appearance of the blade of the key. This is a very important concept. As you are impressioning, you want to roll the key from side to side and change the lighting on the blade of the key. That will sometimes enhance the marks and sometimes it will hide them, but by moving it you will be able to see the marks much easier. Here are two forward key blanks. The one on the left has been prepared, the one on the right has not been prepared. You can see how uniform the surface of the prepared key is in contrast to the rough plated surface of the unprepared key blank. I cannot overstress how important it is to properly prepare the key blank before you ever put it in the lock. Now that we've seen how to properly prepare the key blank for impressioning, let's take a look at the construction of a wafer or disc tumbler lock and the type of marks that this type of lock will give during the impressioning process. This is a pretty typical 5-wafer tumbler cam lock. These locks are very inexpensive and very common. They make an ideal place to begin your study of impressioning. There is no key in the lock at this time, and all 5 of the wafer tumblers are pushed as far up as they will go by their individual springs. Watch as we insert a key blank into the lock. Notice that all of the wafers go down in turn as the key is inserted into the lock, and now they protrude from the bottom of the lock. But they don't protrude evenly. Let's look at it again. The distance that the tumbler protrudes from the bottom of the lock is exactly the distance of the cut that needs to be on that key in order to operate the lock. Here we see the correct key inserted into the lock, and you can see that all 5 of the wafer tumblers are flush with both the top and the bottom surfaces of the plug. Here we have 2 of the wafer tumblers out of our lock. This one corresponds to a number 1 cut, which is no cut at all on the key. This one corresponds to a number 5 cut, which is the deepest possible cut on this particular lock. The key passes through this opening in the center of each of the tumblers. The blade of the key will make contact with the tumbler at this point. This is the only point that the tumbler touches the blade of the key. This is where we will get our marks. Notice the difference between this portion of the 2 tumblers. The difference in thickness corresponds exactly to the difference in the depth of the 2 different cuts. To better illustrate what goes on inside the lock during the impressioning process, we'll use this cutaway diagram of a typical wafer tumbler cam lock. This is the outer housing or shell of the lock. This is the core of the lock, which rotates when the key is turned. This is our tumbler, which once again is a number 5 depth. And this is the spring, which lifts the tumbler all the way to the up position when there is no key in the lock. When the key is inserted into the lock, it passes through this opening, making contact with the lower edge of the opening, pushing the tumbler down against the pressure of the spring until it reaches a point that will allow the core to turn. Either end of the tumbler extending into the slots in the lock housing will prevent the lock from turning. When the correct key is inserted into the lock, the tumbler will align with the top and bottom of the core, allowing the lock to turn. When a key blank is inserted into the lock, the tumbler will be pushed down as far as it can go. This is the condition we'll start in when we begin impressioning. The secret of impressioning is to bind the tumbler against the side of the slot in the housing, preventing the tumbler from moving. Then bump the key against the tumbler while it is bound in place. This pressure of the key hitting against the tumbler while it is in a bound condition is what leaves the mark on the key. In our diagram, the red color is used to indicate where the tumbler is binding. Notice that it binds not only against the lock housing, but against the core also. This holds the tumbler rigidly in place while we press downward on the key blank. This pressure of the key blank against the tumbler is what leaves the impressioning mark. Once we have pressed downward on the key once, though, the tumbler will move slightly, so it will no longer leave a mark. So you must release the tension on the lock between each bump. There are 3 steps involved in impressioning. Number 1, twist the key blank to bind the tumbler in the lock. 2, bump the key to make the mark on the key. 3, release the tension on the lock. These 3 steps, repeated over and over again, are the heart of impressioning. Looking very closely at just the blade of the key where it contacts the tumbler, we see how the twisting force and the downward pressure of bumping the key in the lock work together to leave the mark on the key. This only happens if the tumbler is bound in place. If the tumbler is at the correct height to allow the lock to turn, it will not bind and it will not leave a mark on the key. That is how you know when to stop filing. When the lock does not leave a mark, then you have reached the correct position in that particular cut. However, if you file your cut too deep, the tumbler will bind once again at the top edge this time and will continue to give you a mark until you have cut your key blank in half. This is why it is very important to go slowly. If you pass the correct point, you will once again get marks and ruin your key. One of the biggest problems in impressioning a wafer tumbler lock is keeping the key straight in the lock. As you bump the key, you need to make sure that you don't twist the key up and down in relation to the center line of the lock. You can force tumblers that would not normally be binding into a binding position. This is one of the reasons why an impressioning tool is so handy. Let's put all of our basics together now and see how the key moves in the lock. Remember the 3 steps: twist, bump, release. Twist, bump, and release. Do this over and over again until you feel like you have marks on the key. Then remove the key. An alternate method that is especially effective on wafer tumbler locks is the figure-8 method. Insert the key and twist and bump at the same time in a figure-8 motion. Just make sure that you release the tension on the lock between bumps. Putting the key into the lock and simply wiggling it from side to side is no way to impression. You may get some marks this way, but not nearly the marks that you will get by twisting, binding, and then bumping. Now that we know how to bump the key in the lock and we know how bumping works, let's take a look at the different kinds of marks that you will get on the key from wafer tumbler locks. Here's a key that has been bumped in our wafer tumbler cam lock. The marks you'll see on this key are pretty typical. Watch how they change as the light changes. Because the portion of the tumbler that is in contact with the key blank is basically rectangular, you can expect to have rectangular marks on the key. Most of the marks will be a rectangular line going across the blade of the key. Often, because of the way the key is bumped in the lock, one edge or the other of the tumbler will bite into the key somewhat harder than the other. So it's not unusual to have marks that are stronger on one side of the blank than they are on the other. Also, as the key is moved up and down, sometimes the edges of the tumbler bite into the key blade harder than the rest of the blade. So many times you will have two marks side by side, which are made by the two edges of the tumbler. Now we're ready to put all of the pieces together and actually impression a wafer tumbler cam lock. We'll begin by inserting our key into the lock and twisting and bumping using the figure 8 method, which is what I prefer to use with a wafer tumbler lock. Be careful that you don't twist the key in the lock too hard because you can break the wafers. When we examine our key, we discover that we have 5 marks on the blade of the key. We know we're dealing with a 5-tumbler cam lock, so we have marks from each and every one of the tumblers in the lock. The mark in the number 4 position is especially strong. The mark in the number 5 position is right on the tip of the key. Sometimes these are hard to see out there. Notice as we rotate the key how the changing light makes the marks disappear and reappear. If you roll the key from side to side while you're looking for the marks, you will be able to see the marks blink at you as you move the key. Now we're ready to make our first cuts on the key. Using just the tip of the file, cut directly on top of each one of the marks. Be very careful that you cut exactly on top of the mark. It's very easy to make a mistake in spacing during the early stages of impressioning. If you have any trouble aligning your file with the mark, then you can take the tip of your finger and place it alongside of the key blank and use that to guide the file in the correct position until you get your cut started. Then you can go ahead and cut it in the normal fashion. Make sure that you make the last pass across the key in the forward direction. Here's our key after we've filed all 5 of the marks. Notice that the bottoms of each one of the cuts is very smooth and flat. It's very important that we maintain our smooth finish if we're going to be able to see any future marks. The amount of metal that you take off the key is something that you will learn with practice. But in the beginning, just take off as little metal as you can. It's easy to take off more metal if you need to go deeper, but you can't put it back on. After putting the key back into the lock, we get 4 more marks. Marks in positions 1 through 4. Notice how number 1 and 4 are particularly strong. They're actual gouges in the side of the key. The mark in number 1 shows the typical double marks that you get with wafer tumbler locks. Notice how the light makes the marks change as we roll the key back and forth in the light. If you do this quickly, you will see the marks blink at you. Here is our same key after we've filed the marks. Notice that we filed numbers 1 and 4 somewhat deeper than 2 and 3. This is because they were such strong marks. There was also a faint mark out on the number 5 position, but I didn't trust it. All I did was clean up that cut so that if there is indeed a mark there, it will show up better next time. After inserting the key back into the lock, twisting and bumping, we get 2 good marks this time. Once again in the numbers 1 and 4 positions. These are the positions that were giving us the real strong marks earlier. Watch as the marks change in the light. You can see that the number 1 mark actually digs into the side of the key blank itself. These are typical wafer tumbler marks. They look like double lines across the key. And here's our key after we've filed the marks. Remember, we only had 2 marks, one in the number 1 and one in the number 4 position, so that's the only place we filed the key. We left cuts 2, 3, and 5 strictly alone. After working the key in the lock one more time, we have marks in cuts numbers 1, 4, and 5 this time. That faint mark, the number 5 mark, has come back, but this time it's somewhat stronger. It will only show up, though, as we rotate the key. Watch as the light changes in the number 5 position. This is not unusual at all for a mark to only appear when the light is in a certain way. There, you see the mark across the key? A straight line across the number 5 cut. It's actually a very shiny spot where the tumbler has been pushing downward against the key blank. And here's our key after we've filed each one of the marks. numbers 1, 4, and 5. Notice that we've kept the bottoms of each of the cuts just as smooth and flat as we possibly can. We haven't touched cuts numbers 2 and 3 because we didn't have a mark there. After working the key in the lock, we get two real strong marks out near the tip in cuts numbers 4 and 5. These are real deep gouges in the bottom of each one of the cuts. You can still see them when the key is turned almost sideways. This type of mark tells us that we're very near the end. You only get this kind of mark when you're very close to having a working key. And here's our key after we've cut it, ready to go back into the lock. We're keeping the bottoms of the cuts just as smooth and flat as we can. The amount of metal that we took off this time was not as much as earlier because our marks told us that we were very near to having a working key, so we didn't want to take off too much metal. Insert the key back into the lock, twist and bump, and it starts to turn. It does not turn easily, it's tight all the way around. And here's our key. We have 4 real strong marks, the same kind of marks we had in 4 and 5 earlier, but these are in 1, 3, 4, and 5. Notice especially the ones in 1 and 4. These are real deep marks. But remember, this is a working key, so we just barely want to file the key just enough to make the marks go away to get a good, smooth working key. And here is our finished key. We've cleaned up cuts numbers 1, 3, 4, and 5, and we now have a good, smooth turning key. Now let's see how to impression a slightly more difficult lock. This is an older Toyota ignition lock. This lock uses a double-sided key, but all of the tumblers are on one side of the lock, so the key only has to be cut on one side. This is what's known as a single-throw lock. Here's the plug out of our Toyota lock. Other than the fact that the key will go in either way, this lock is really very similar to the cam lock that we just saw. All of the tumblers are on one side of the lock, and when you insert the key into the lock, they all extend out from the other side of the lock. There are 6 tumblers, and they are somewhat more fragile than the cam lock tumblers. You need to be very careful about exerting too much force on this lock because the tumblers can be easily damaged. Because all of the tumblers are on one side of the lock, the key only needs to be cut on one side in order to operate. While we're impressioning this lock, we'll only be working on one side of the key blank. But you must make sure that the key goes back into the lock the same way that it came out. Otherwise, your marks won't be where you're expecting them to be. Another thing you have to be careful about while working on one of these locks is to keep the key on the center line of the lock. If you angle it up and down like this, you will sometimes get false marks while you're impressioning. So make sure that you keep the key blank on the center line of the lock as you impression. Whenever you impression a double-sided key, always begin by checking the lock to make sure whether it's a single throw or double throw lock. Using a pick to rake each side of the lock will tell you very quickly if all of the tumblers are on one side or if they are actually on both sides of the lock. With the pick, we determine that all of the tumblers are on the bottom of this lock. So we'll be using the figure 8 method, pushing downward on the key blank, keeping it on the center line of the lock. Here's our key after removing it from the lock. This is the edge of the key that was down while we were working it in the lock. We have 3 good marks, one in the number 1, 3, and 4 position. Watch how the marks change as we roll the key in the light. See them blink at you? This is the way it will look when you roll the key blank as you're looking for the marks. Here's our key after we've filed it. The amount of metal that you take off can be learned by practice and familiarity with the particular lock. If you know what the depths are, it will help you a great deal in determining how much to file off. But if you're in doubt, only take off a small amount. It's always better to take off too little than too much. After working the key in the lock, we only have one good mark, and it is a good mark. It's a typical wafer tumbler mark. It's hard to see until you roll the key. You'll see a gouge appear on opposite sides of the key blank along the edge. First you see it on one side, and then you see it on the other. This is not unusual at all with wafer tumbler locks. It's quite common. This is one more reason why you must roll the key blank in order to see the marks. We filed the number 3 cut down one more depth, and we're ready to put the key back into the lock. Remember to keep the bottoms of each one of the cuts just as smooth and flat as you possibly can. After working the key in the lock, we have one real strong mark in the number 5 position now. This is a new mark. It is a very strong mark. Watch as we roll the key from side to side. You can see that the mark extends all the way across the key blank. Now there is also a very faint mark in the number 4 position, but because the number 5 mark is so strong and the number 4 is so faint, I'm just going to file the number 5 cut and see if the mark in number 4 continues to show up. Look at how the mark goes all the way across the blade of the key in number 5. Here's the key after we've filed it. We've taken it down one complete depth because we're familiar with the depths on this particular lock. If you're not familiar with the depths, then just take off a little bit of metal. This time we have 3 marks, 2 of which are brand new. We have a good mark in the number 2 position and another good mark in the number 6 position. The number 5 mark is back also. Numbers 2 and 6 are brand new marks. Watch the number 6 as we roll the key in the light. See how it shows up as a line as we roll the key? A line that goes all the way across the key blank. Number 2 is very similar. The number 5 mark is a very deep mark in the center of the cut. It's actually a gouge. Here's the key after it's been filed. Once again, we went down one complete depth in each one of the new cuts and one cut deeper in the number 5 cut. And this time, when we insert the key into the lock, it works smoothly, no binding at all. This is because we were familiar with the depths used on these Toyota locks, and we cut our key one depth at a time. Of course, it only works on one side. In order to make a key that works on both sides, we'll have to transpose our cuts onto the opposite side of the key. Now let's look at a more challenging Toyota lock, a late-model double-throw Toyota door lock. By checking this lock with a pick, we determine that it does indeed have tumblers on both sides of the lock. This means that the key must be impressioned on both sides at the same time. Here's the core out of the lock. We see that it has 4 tumblers on one side and 3 on the other. There are actually 8 tumblers in the system, but the 8th cut is only in the ignition lock. When we insert a key blank into the lock, we have tumblers extending from both sides of the lock. This lock behaves like 2 of our cam locks put together, and we will have to impression both sides of the key at the same time. Here are 2 keys that look quite different, but will both operate the lock. The key on the top has 4 cuts per side and will work if it is inserted properly into the lock. The bottom key has 8 cuts on each side and will work regardless of which direction it is inserted into the door lock. Here's the key that only has 4 cuts per side. This key is very much like the one that we'll get when we impression the lock. It will work just fine if you insert it one way, but if you take it out and insert it the other direction, it will not work at all. Once we have impressioned the key, we will have to transpose the cuts from each side onto the opposite side to have a good working key. Before we begin impressioning, we'll prepare the key blank just as we did with the other locks, except we'll prepare both sides of the key blade. Once we have both sides of the blade prepared, then we'll put a notch in the head of the key on one side only. This gives us an index so that we can always tell which way the key was inserted into the lock. As we work the key in the lock, we need to pay particular attention to the way we're bumping it so that we bind the tumblers and get marks on both sides of the key blank. And here's our key and the marks. We have 4 good marks on the top side of the key as we inserted it into the lock, and 1 on the bottom side. You can only see 3 of the marks in this view, but the 4th mark toward the tip will appear as we rotate the key around in the light. Watch the tip of the key. There, you can see the mark appear all the way out on the tip of the key blade. There is a very similar mark all the way out on the tip of the other side of the key blank. Since we have 4 marks on the top side, we know that there will only be 3 marks on the bottom side, since this is a door lock and there are 4 tumblers on one side and 3 on the other. Here's our key after we've filed it. Notice the spacing. The cut on the bottom side of the key is between the 2 tip cuts on the top side of the key. That's the way it will go all the way along. All of the cuts from one side will be staggered compared to the cuts on the other side of the key. This is typical of this type of lock. And after working the key in the lock, we have 3 real good marks. 2 real strong ones on the top side of the blade and 1 on the bottom side inside our earlier cut. See how these are actually gouges along the edge of the key blade? Watch as they change as we rotate the key in the light. These marks are very easy to see and very typical of wafer tumbler locks. On the opposite side of the key, we have an even larger mark in our tip cut. It is a big gouge on the lower edge of the key blade. It's not unusual at all for your mark to be on just one side of the key blade. Here we rotate it in the light and you can see that it's a very large gouge. After making our cut, it becomes more obvious how the cuts are staggered between each other on the different sides of the key. This becomes more pronounced as we go along. After working the key in the lock, we now have 7 marks on the key. All 7 tumblers are marking. The 4 on the upper side show up as shiny spots on the lower edge of the blade in this view. As we rotate the key around, you'll see the marks come up on the opposite side. We have 2 new marks that show up as rectangular lines across the blade of the key, and a 3rd mark inside our earlier cut that won't become visible until about here. You'll see it show up as a shiny spot right on the edge of the cut. It's actually a gouge on the edge of the cut. Here's the key after we've filed each one of the marks. We now have all 7 cuts showing up on the key. Notice that we're keeping the bottoms of each one of the cuts just as smooth and flat as we possibly can so that the marks will show up better. After working the key in the lock one more time, we have 4 good marks on the key, 2 on each side. On the lower side of the key, as we inserted it into the lock, we have marks in cuts numbers 3 and 4. There is no mark in number 2, and there will be no mark in position number 1 because that tumbler is only found in the ignition lock. But we have 2 good gouges in the 3 and 4 positions on this side of the key. On the other side of the key, we have good marks in cuts numbers 1 and 4. Both of these marks are strong gouges into one side of the key blank. This is very common on this type of lock. Once again, we've filed our key everywhere we have a mark, and you can see better than ever how the cuts are staggered opposite each other on the 2 different sides of the blade. 3 cuts on one side and 4 on the other. After working the key in the lock one more time, we have 2 good marks in cuts numbers 1 and 2. The mark in cut number 1 is a very strong gouge on one edge of the blank. The mark in number 2 is a line that goes all the way across the key on the upslope, the forward slope of the cut. This tells us that our spacing is just slightly off. We'll need to move this cut slightly forward when we file it. As the key turns, you can see the line go across the key blank on the forward slope of the number 2 cut. There you can see the gouge very easily. This shows up very easily as you roll the key in the light. On the other side of the key, we have an equally good mark in the number 1 position. Once again, this is a gouge into the side of the key blank. It's only on one side of the cut. Here's our key after we've filed all of the marks. We've moved our number 2 cut on the top side slightly forward because of the position that the mark appeared in. You can see even better now how the cuts are staggered across from each other. When we insert the key into the lock this time, it turns easily. We can now either transpose the cuts from this key onto both sides of another key blank, or we can decode this key and make one from code. Notice that the key does not work at all inserted the wrong way. Only when it's inserted the way we've been working on it will it operate the lock. To finish the job, we'll cut all of the cuts from both sides of our impression key onto each side of a duplicate key. We'll use a key machine for this. You could also decode your impression key and cut a new key from code. First, copy one side onto both sides of the duplicate key. Next, we'll turn our impression key over and copy all of the cuts from the other side onto both sides of the duplicate key once again. We actually cut the duplicate key 4 times, twice on each side. Here are the finished keys. Our impression key is on the right. It has 7 cuts on it, 4 on one side, 3 on the other. Had this been an actual car that we were working on instead of just the door lock, we would have gone ahead and progressed the number 1 cut on the left-hand side of this key to get our missing cut for the ignition lock. The key on the left is our copied key, which has all 7 cuts on both sides. That completes the wafer tumbler locks. Now let's take a look at how to impression pin tumbler locks. This diagram shows a cross-section through a typical pin tumbler lock. We're only looking at one tumbler in this example. This is the outer housing of the lock. This is the pin chamber, which contains the spring, the top pin, which is sometimes called the driver, and the bottom pin. The key is inserted into the keyway here, and this is the core of the lock, which rotates when the correct key is inserted. This point where the top pin and the bottom pin meet is known as the shear line. This is where the 2 pins separate when the correct key is inserted into the lock. When there is no key in the lock, the core cannot turn because the top pin is extending between the outer housing of the lock and the lock core. The top pin and the bottom pin together are known as the pin stack. If the pin stack is raised too high, then the bottom pin will extend between the core of the lock and the lock housing, preventing the core from turning. The lock core can only rotate when the pin stack has been raised so that the shear line between the 2 pins is flush with the top edge of the lock core. The bottom pin is held captive inside the lock core as it rotates. When we impression a pin tumbler cylinder, we use the same 3 steps that we used on a wafer tumbler cylinder. We twist to bind the lock, bump the key to make the mark, and then release. When we twist, we are binding the bottom pin between the lock core and the lock housing. Bumping the key against the pin while it is bound makes our mark. But just as with the wafer tumbler lock, the pin moves slightly when we bump it. Bumping it a second time will not give you a mark. You must release the cylinder between bumps. The tolerances in our drawing have been somewhat exaggerated to better show you the different movements of the pin. Just as in our earlier diagram, the red color is used to indicate where the binding forces are taking place. Notice that the bottom of the bottom pin is pointed where it presses against the key blade. This means that instead of a rectangular mark as we had on our wafer tumbler locks, we will very often have round marks square in the center of the key blade. However, if the key blade is offset to one side, such as in a Ford, then our round marks will appear on either one side or the other of the key blade. Just as with the wafer tumbler lock, the marks will stop when your key is filed to the correct depth. This is because there is no longer a binding force on the pin when the pin is at the shear line. However, just as with the wafer tumbler lock, if you file too deeply, the marks will resume. This is because the top pin is then binding between the housing and the core, giving you marks once again for the same reason that the bottom pin gave you marks, because of the binding force. You must file your key slowly. If you take off too much metal, you will pass the shear point and you will never know it. Let's look at some typical pin tumbler marks. There are 4 marks on this key actually. The 2 strongest marks are highlighted with the arrows. These are typical pin tumbler marks. We're just starting out on this particular key. They are round, shiny spots in the center of the key blade. Here's the same key a little further along in the impressioning process. These are really good marks. These are round dents in the center of the key blade. They're actual depressions in the blade of the key. With most pin tumbler locks, I prefer a straightforward twist and bump method of bumping. Twist to one side and bump. Twist to the other side and bump. Always bumping in the direction of the pin stack. The figure 8 method of key bumping is also effective on pin tumbler locks, but not as effective as it is on a wafer tumbler lock. If I'm having trouble getting marks on a key, I will alternate between the twist and bump and the figure 8 method of bumping. Just as with the wafer tumbler lock, simply putting the key in the lock and wiggling it from side to side is no way to impression. You might get a mark or two this way, but nothing like you will get when you twist and bump. Now let's see how to impression a pin tumbler Ford door lock. The pin tumbler Ford locks are a good place to start your study of pin tumbler impressioning. They have large pins and they generally leave good marks. We'll be using both the figure 8 method and the twist and bump method on these. Remember to prepare your key blank as we showed you earlier in the video. And here's our key after we've worked it in the lock. One of the things you need to be careful about with any automotive door lock is the dust cover. They can very often leave a mark on the key that can be misinterpreted as an impressioning mark. The arrow pointing downwards is pointing to the mark left by the dust cover. There are 3 good typical pin tumbler marks on this key. The mark in the number 2 position is not really a mark. Watch what happens when we clean the key blank. It completely goes away. Now as we roll the key in the light, you'll be able to see the marks in the numbers 1, 3, and 4 position come up. You need to be very careful about dirt and oil in automotive door locks. It's very easy to mistake dirt or oil as a mark. Here's the key after we've filed all 3 of our marks, ready to go back into the lock. These 2 marks were very easy to see with the naked eye, but they were very difficult to photograph. The mark in the number 3 position is on the rear slope of the cut, which tells us that our spacing is slightly too far forward. The mark all the way out on the tip is typical of a Ford lock. It is at the very, very tip of the key. If you watch carefully, you will see a shiny spot appear and disappear as we move the light. Once again, these were very easy to see with the naked eye, but the camera had difficulty bringing them up. After filing the key and working it in the lock again, we have 3 real good marks. These are the same marks you saw earlier. These are actual depressions in the surface of the key. This tells us that we're very close to having a working key. And this time, when we insert the key into the lock, it turns. It's very stiff, but it does turn. And after turning the key in the lock, we have two really large marks in the numbers 3 and 5 cuts. After we clean these two marks up, the key will turn freely. Notice how these are actual gouges deep into the key. We only want to file the key enough to remove the mark, and we will have a smooth working key. Now let's take a look at one of the more difficult pin tumbler locks to impression, a 5-pin schlage mortise cylinder. As a general rule, the more play there is in a lock, the better the marks you'll get. Since there's very little play in a schlage lock, the marks will be very small. And here's our first set of marks. We have 3 nice little marks right in the center of the blade. They're little round, shiny spots. Watch what happens to the marks, though, when we move the blade of the key in the light. They disappear. Then they reappear as the light changes. This is why it's so very, very important that you roll the key blank while you're looking for your marks. And here's the key blank after we filed it, ready to go back into the lock. We now have 5 marks on the key, 1 in each one of our 3 cuts that we already have on the key, plus 2 new marks in the numbers 2 and 5 position. The number 5 mark is all the way out on the tip. This is where it will always be on a 5-pin schlage. They're very difficult to see out there. After filing our key and working it in the lock one more time, we once again have 5 marks, 1 in each one of the cuts. Notice that they are all small, round dents in the center of the key blade. This is a typical pin tumbler mark. After filing our key and working it in the lock, we have 3 good marks. We have one in the numbers 1, 3, and 5 positions. Watch how the marks change as we change the light, particularly the one in the number 5 position. This mark was very easy to see with the naked eye, but hard to photograph. The mark in the number 2 position is rather faint, and with a schlage lock, I don't like to file it unless I have a real good mark, so we won't touch the number 2 position. After filing our key and working it in the lock, we now have 4 good marks. We have marks in the numbers 1, 2, 4, and 5 positions. The mark in the number 2 position came up very strong. The mark in the number 5 position, though, is on the rear slope of the cut. This tells us that our spacing is slightly off, and we'll be moving that cut slightly to the rear as we file it this time. We now have good marks in cuts numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. Number 2 is a particularly strong mark. There's no mark at all in the number 5 position, so we'll leave that one completely alone. Still using the twist and bump method, we find that we have 2 good marks in the numbers 1 and 2 position. Just the kind of marks we'd expect to see. Little round dents into the face of the key blank. Notice how they change as we move the key in the light. This time we have marks in numbers 1, 2, and 4. Notice the mark in number 1. It looks like a little crater in the face of the key blank. This means that the key is either about to turn or that particular cut is almost at the correct depth. Notice the mark in number 4 doesn't show up until we rotate the key in the light. Watch as we come back down. You'll see the mark right there. See it come up? This is why you have to roll the key in the light. This time around we have 3 marks, but in the number 1, 3, and 5 positions. All 3 of them are relatively good marks, especially the one in number 3. It's a little dent into the face of the blank. This tells us that we're getting very close to a working key. And this time, when we insert the key into the lock, it turns easily. This is a characteristic of schlage and other cylinders that have very tight tolerances. Usually the tolerances are so close that when you get a key to work them, it will work easily the first time. And here is our finished key. We can either clean this one up a little and use it as is, or we can decode it and cut a new one using a code machine or depth keys. That concludes Mastering the Art of Impressioning. I hope you enjoyed watching this tape as much as I enjoyed making it. If you would like more information on this or any other TechTrain product, please write to us at this address: TechTrain Productions, Post Office Box 15401, Pensacola, Florida 32514. Our toll-free order line is 1-800-356-0136. Or you can fax us at area code 904-476-7410. Thank you for choosing TechTrain.